"Sir, you need to sit down right now, or we'll have you removed from this aircraft." The sentence cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. For a second, nobody moved. A fork froze halfway between a plate and a businessman's mouth. A woman in row 3 stopped tightening her seatbelt. The soft hum of the engines outside seemed suddenly louder, deeper, like the plane itself was listening. And in the narrow aisle of economy class stood a tall black man in a dark navy suit. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, one hand resting lightly on the back of a seat, his posture straight, shoulders square, eyes fixed on the flight attendant in front of him. His voice, when it came, was low, calm, controlled. Either someone explains why I was forced out of my first-class seat, or this plane isn't leaving the ground. A ripple of whispers spread through the rows like wind across dry grass. Another delay. That was the first thought running through the minds of most passengers. People sighed. Phones appeared. Someone muttered under their breath about missing a connection in San Francisco. But a few passengers looked closer, because there was something strange about the man standing in the aisle. He wasn't angry. Angry men raise their voices. They point fingers. They lose control. This man didn't. He looked certain, like someone who had already calculated how this would end. The flight attendant blocking his path was Lauren Whitaker, 36 years old, 12 years with Atlantic Air. Her smile was gone. Now her lips were pressed tight, eyes sharp with the brittle authority of someone who believed she had already won. "Sir," she said again, louder now so the surrounding rows could hear, "you are obstructing the aisle and delaying departure. You need to take your assigned seat immediately." Assigned seat. The words hung there. Row 24. Seat C, Economy Plus. 3 rows behind the wing. The man's gaze didn't leave her face. Assigned seat. He let the phrase sit in the air for a moment. Then he spoke again. "That's interesting," he said quietly, "because my ticket says Seat 2A. A few heads turned. 2A. First class. Lauren's jaw tightened. We had to make a last-minute adjustment for weight balance. Her tone carried the rehearsed confidence of a line repeated many times before. Your new seat is 24C. Behind her, near the front of the cabin, a curtain separating first class from economy shifted slightly as a passenger leaned forward to watch. But the man in the aisle didn't move. He didn't sit. Instead, he glanced toward the front of the aircraft, past the rows of cramped seats, past the thin gray curtain, toward a place where the lighting grew warmer and the seats widened into quiet leather pods. Seat 2A. Empty. He had walked past it only minutes earlier. The leather was untouched. The blanket still folded, the champagne flute on the tray table, waiting for someone who had never arrived. A lie. He knew it. And now, slowly, other passengers were beginning to sense it too. Lauren shifted her weight, impatience creeping into her voice. "Sir, this isn't a discussion." She gestured toward the back. "Take your seat." But the man didn't even look in that direction. Instead, he drew in a slow breath. And for just a moment, behind the calm mask of his expression, something old stirred in his memory. A conference room in Chicago, years ago. A long, polished table filled with executives, and a young man standing near the door, holding a folder, while someone asked him where the janitor kept the extra coffee filters. They hadn't even considered the possibility that he belonged there. That memory had never really left him. Not when he graduated from the University of Michigan. Not when he earned his MBA from Stanford. Not when he built a cybersecurity company from a cramped rental office into one of the most powerful digital defense firms in the country. Success didn't erase certain looks, certain assumptions. And the look Lauren Whitaker was giving him right now, he knew that look. Behind him, a man in his early 30s leaned sideways in his seat, studying the situation with growing interest. His name was Jason Miller, technology journalist, sharp eyes, quick instincts. He had been halfway through drafting an article when the argument near the front caught his attention. Now he glanced again at the man standing in the aisle. Something about the face seemed familiar. The posture, the voice. Jason's brow furrowed. No, it couldn't be. But the possibility tightened something in his chest. Up front, Lauren took a step closer. Her voice dropped into the strained patience of someone who had already decided the other person was unreasonable. "If you refuse to comply," she said, "I will have security meet this aircraft and escort you off." That did it. The cabin grew even quieter. Because that word meant something. Security. Removal. Public humiliation. And everyone in that moment understood the unspoken calculation the man in the aisle was being forced to make. Sit down. Swallow the insult. Let the plane leave. Or stand here and risk becoming the disruptive passenger everyone would blame for a delayed flight. The man's eyes drifted across the rows. He saw the curiosity, the annoyance, the indifference. He had seen all of those before, too. Then his gaze returned to Lauren, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something colder now. Not anger. Authority. "I'm not refusing a seat," he said. He slowly lifted the boarding pass in his hand. "I'm refusing a lie." Lauren opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a quiet voice came from the seat beside Jason. An older woman, silver hair pulled back neatly, leaned toward the aisle. "Excuse me," she said softly. Lauren turned. "Yes, ma'am?" The woman nodded towards the front of the plane. "I walked past first class when I boarded." Her voice was calm but steady. "That seat is empty." The sentence landed like a stone dropped in still water. Ripples of whispers spread again. Lauren's face flushed. "That's not relevant," she snapped quickly. "It absolutely is," another passenger muttered. Jason Miller felt the moment shift. This wasn't just an argument anymore. Something larger was unfolding. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The camera lens pointed toward the aisle, toward the man still standing there, toward the flight attendant, toward the invisible tension tightening around everyone in the cabin. And as Jason focused the frame, his eyes locked once more on the man's face. Then the recognition hit him. Hard. His pulse jumped, because suddenly he knew exactly who was standing in that aisle. And if he was right, this flight wasn't just delayed. It was about to explode. Jason Miller's thumb hovered over his phone screen, but for a moment he didn't press record. Because if he was right about the man standing in that aisle, this was about to become something far bigger than a seating dispute. He leaned forward slightly, studying the man again. The broad shoulders, the calm eyes, the quiet authority in the way he held himself, even with half a plane staring at him. Jason had seen that face before. Not in person. On magazine covers, business journals, technology panels. And suddenly the name slammed into his mind like a door blown open. Marcus Bennett, CEO of Titan Shield Cybersecurity. Jason felt the air leave his lungs. Titan Shield wasn't just another tech company. They protected the digital infrastructure of banks, hospitals, and government agencies across the country. The kind of company that people only heard about when something catastrophic was prevented. Marcus Bennett had built it from a tiny startup in Detroit into a corporation valued at more than $8 billion. And right now, that man was standing in economy class, being told to sit down like a disruptive passenger. Jason blinked once, then quickly lifted his phone. The camera started recording. Across the aisle, Lauren Whitaker was losing patience. Her smile had completely disappeared now. "Sir," she said sharply, "this is your final warning." Marcus Bennett didn't move. He stood there as if rooted to the floor. The overhead lights cast a dull yellow glow across the cabin, catching the faint silver threads beginning to appear at his temples. At 42 years old, Marcus carried the quiet gravity of someone who had spent decades solving problems most people never even knew existed. But in this moment, he looked less like a billionaire executive and more like a man weighing a decision. Because this was not a simple argument. It was a choice. Sit down. Let the insult slide. Land in San Francisco quietly and sign a $320 million deal with Helix Dynamics in the morning, or stand here and turn this flight into something the airline would never forget. His jaw tightened slightly. In the silence, he heard another voice in his memory. His father's voice. James Bennett, a man who had spent 30 years working the night shift at a Detroit auto plant. Marcus could still see him sitting at the kitchen table after work, hands rough with grease and steel dust, telling his son something he repeated over and over again. "Son, the world will test you." Marcus had been 16 the first time he asked what that meant. His father had looked him straight in the eye. "And when it does," James Bennett had said quietly, "you have to decide who you are." That memory flickered through Marcus's mind like a photograph, and then it was gone. Back in the cabin, Lauren crossed her arms. "Security will remove you if necessary." The threat hung in the air. Marcus finally shifted. Not backward, forward. Just one step. Gasps flickered through the rows. Lauren stiffened. Marcus lifted his boarding pass again, holding it where she could see it clearly. Seat 2A. First class, printed in bold black letters. His voice came out calm, controlled. "Let's be very clear about something," he said. "I bought that seat. I paid for that seat. And I walked past that seat 5 minutes ago." He paused. "And it's still empty." A murmur swept across the cabin. Lauren's eyes darted briefly toward the curtain separating first class from economy. A tiny movement. But Jason Miller caught it. So did a few other passengers. One man leaned out into the aisle to look forward. Another passenger turned in his seat. The suspicion was spreading now, and suspicion once it started, was almost impossible to contain. Lauren forced a tight laugh. "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point," Marcus replied. Jason felt his pulse pounding as he held the phone steady. This was happening, in real time, right in front of him. He leaned forward slightly and spoke quietly toward Marcus. "Mr. Bennett, Marcus turned his head. Their eyes met. Recognition flickered there for a second. Jason gave a small nod. "Jason Miller," he said. "Tech press." Marcus didn't react outwardly, but something in his gaze sharpened. Jason angled the phone slightly so Marcus could see the screen, the camera, the recording timer counting upward. Then Jason turned the phone around again and spoke just loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. "For the record," he said, "Seat 2A is visible from here." Several passengers leaned sideways. They could see it now. The open space beyond the curtain. Empty. No passenger. No luggage. Just an untouched leather seat waiting for someone who had been told he didn't belong there. The tension in the cabin thickened. Lauren felt it slipping. Control. Authority. The neat narrative that this was simply an operational adjustment. She stepped closer to Marcus, lowering her voice. "You're making this much worse than it needs to be." Marcus looked down at her. His expression didn't change. "Am I?" Lauren leaned in. "Sit down," she whispered, "or you'll regret it." Jason's eyebrows rose. The threat was clear. But Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he looked past Lauren toward the cockpit door at the front of the aircraft. Then he spoke again. This time, louder. Clear enough for the entire cabin to hear. "I would like to speak to the captain." The sentence hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Lauren froze. "No." The word came out too fast. Too sharp. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "No. You do not get to demand access to the cockpit." "I'm not demanding access," Marcus said evenly. "I'm requesting the highest authority on this aircraft explain why I was removed from the seat I purchased." The logic landed hard. Lauren's eyes flickered again. Because now the entire cabin was watching. Phones were up. Recording. The story had shifted. This wasn't a passenger refusing to sit down. This was a man asking a question. A question nobody in uniform seemed ready to answer. Jason felt the moment tightening like a wire pulled too far. He glanced at the phone screen. Hundreds of viewers were already watching the live stream. The number kept climbing. Fast. Someone had recognized Marcus Bennett. Comments were flooding the feed. Jason looked back up just as the cockpit door opened. A tall man in a white pilot's shirt stepped into the aisle. Captain Daniel Harper. 55 years old. 30,000 flight hours. A man used to command. His eyes scanned the scene. The standing passenger. The nervous flight attendant. The dozens of phones pointed toward them. And suddenly the entire aircraft seemed to hold its breath. Captain Daniel Harper stepped fully into the aisle, and the cabin seemed to tighten around him. His presence carried the quiet gravity of a man who had spent more than 30 years in the air, the kind of authority that usually ended disputes before they had time to grow. His eyes moved slowly from Lauren Whitaker to the tall man standing in the aisle, then across the raised phones and the uneasy faces watching from every seat. He did not raise his voice. "What's going on here?" The question was simple, but it landed with weight. Lauren spoke immediately, too quickly. "Captain, this passenger is refusing his assigned seat and delaying departure." Her voice had the brittle confidence of someone hoping the authority beside her would close the conversation before anyone asked more questions. Marcus Bennett did not interrupt. He watched the captain the way a chess player watches the board, calculating. Captain Harper's gaze shifted to him. "Sir, is that accurate?" The cabin went quiet again, the quiet that arrives when everyone senses the next words will matter. Marcus lifted the boarding pass in his hand. "My name is Marcus Bennett. I purchased seat 2A in first class." He paused, letting the sentence sit in the air. "I was reassigned to seat 24C under the explanation of weight balance." He nodded toward the front of the aircraft. "But that seat is still empty." Harper's expression did not change, but his eyes flickered toward the first-class curtain. Lauren stepped in quickly. "Captain, operations required the adjustment." The captain held up a hand without looking at her. It was not a dramatic gesture, but it stopped her mid-sentence. He turned back to Marcus. "Did you board with a valid first-class ticket?" Marcus held it out. Harper took it, scanning the printed line. "Seat 2A." He frowned slightly. From row 24, Jason Miller leaned into the aisle, his phone still recording. The live comments scrolling on the screen had become a blur of reactions. Thousands of people watching the unfolding scene in real time. Jason spoke carefully. "Captain, I'm a journalist. I photographed the front cabin when we boarded. The seat is empty." He turned the phone briefly so the captain could see the image. Harper looked at the screen. An untouched leather seat, a folded blanket, a glass waiting on a tray. Nobody sitting there. The captain's jaw tightened slightly. He looked at Lauren. "Why is the seat empty?" Lauren hesitated. It was the smallest pause, but it rippled through the cabin like a signal flare. "We had to keep it open for weight distribution." Harper looked back toward the front again. Something in his expression sharpened, because he had flown long enough to know when a technical explanation didn't hold together. And the cabin knew it too. An older man near the aisle spoke up quietly. "Captain, I fly this route every week." Harper turned toward him. "Yes, sir. I've never seen weight balance handled like this." Another voice from 2 rows behind joined in. "That seat's been empty since we boarded." The murmur of agreement began spreading again. Lauren felt it slipping, the control she had relied on. She stepped closer to the captain, lowering her voice. "We're already behind schedule." The words were meant to push him toward the fastest solution. "Sit the passenger down. Close the door. Leave." But Harper didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned back to Marcus Bennett, and for the first time, he really looked at him. The calm posture, the steady breathing, the eyes that did not flinch under pressure. Marcus Bennett met that look without blinking. The captain spoke slowly. "Mr. Bennett, why didn't you just take the reassigned seat and file a complaint after the flight?" It was not an accusation. It was the question of a man trying to understand the shape of the problem. Marcus took a breath, and the answer came out quiet. Because the lie would still be there tomorrow. The sentence hung in the air. Jason felt a chill run through him. Marcus continued. "And the next passenger who looks like me would be told the same thing." Several passengers shifted in their seats. The words landed heavier than anyone expected. Lauren's face flushed. "This isn't about that." Marcus looked at her. "Isn't it?" Harper raised a hand again before the argument could reignite. The captain's gaze moved across the phone's recording, the murmuring passengers, the journalist filming the entire exchange. He understood something now. This was no longer a simple seat dispute. This was a moment already escaping the plane, already spreading beyond the runway. Jason's phone buzzed with a new wave of notifications. Thousands of viewers had become tens of thousands. Someone had posted Marcus Bennett's name under the video. The comment section exploded. Harper handed the boarding pass back. "Mr. Bennett, please wait here." He turned toward Lauren. "Come with me." They stepped a few feet toward the cockpit door, their voices low but tense. "What exactly happened at the gate?" Harper asked. Lauren's answer came carefully. "Operations flagged the seat." "Did they?" Harper's tone was still calm, but there was steel in it now. Lauren hesitated again. That hesitation told him everything he needed to know. Behind them, Marcus stood motionless. Jason watched the moment with the instinct of someone who knew history sometimes arrived quietly before it exploded. He leaned toward Marcus. "This is already trending." Marcus didn't look at the phone. His eyes stayed on the captain. "What happens next?" Jason whispered. Marcus's voice was almost inaudible. "The truth." Up front, the cockpit door opened again. Harper stepped back into the aisle. His expression had changed slightly, the way a judge's expression changes when a new piece of evidence enters the room. He looked at Lauren once more, then at Marcus. "Mr. Bennett," he said evenly, "I'm going to need to see the passenger manifest." Lauren's breath caught, because the manifest would show something she could not change. And suddenly the tension in the cabin climbed again, sharper than before, because everyone understood what was about to happen. The moment the manifest appeared, the truth would either save the airline or destroy it. Lauren Whitaker's fingers tightened around the tablet in her hand. For a brief moment, she didn't move. The request hung in the air between her and Captain Daniel Harper, like a blade. The passenger manifest. There was no improvising around that. No clever phrasing. No operational excuse. Just names. Seats. Facts. Lauren forced a breath through her nose and turned toward the galley. "I'll pull it up." The words sounded steady, but the muscles along her jaw had begun to twitch. Across the aisle, Marcus Bennett watched her quietly. He had seen this moment before. Not on airplanes, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in quiet offices where people slowly realized the story they had been telling was about to collapse under the weight of evidence. And there was always the same pause. The moment just before the truth arrived. Behind him, Jason Miller's phone vibrated again. The viewer count had jumped dramatically. 50,000. 70,000. The comments were flying past, too fast to read. Jason glanced up at Marcus again. Still calm. Still perfectly still. Jason whispered under his breath, almost to himself. "This is going everywhere." Marcus didn't respond. At the front of the cabin, Lauren returned with the tablet. The screen glowed pale blue in the dim cabin light. Captain Harper held out his hand. "Let me see it." Lauren hesitated for half a second before placing it in his palm. The captain turned slightly, angling the screen away from the cameras and the crowd. His eyes moved slowly down the list. Row 1. Row 2. Seat 2A. He stopped. A deep line formed between his brows. Then he read the name again. Marcus Bennett, assigned, confirmed, no seat change recorded, no operational flag, nothing. Harper lifted his head. The silence in the cabin had thickened so much it felt almost physical. He looked directly at Lauren. Why does the manifest show Mr. Bennett in seat 2, eh? Lauren's throat moved as she swallowed. Operations must not have updated. Operations doesn't work like that. The interruption was calm, flat. But it landed harder than if he had shouted. Lauren's eyes flicked briefly toward the curtain separating first class. The tiny movement didn't go unnoticed. Several passengers leaned sideways again. Jason zoomed the camera slightly. Marcus noticed it too, and he followed her glance. The empty seat. 2A. Still untouched. Captain Harper exhaled slowly and turned toward Marcus. Mr. Bennett, according to the manifest, seat 2A is still assigned to you. A ripple of whispers broke out instantly. Lauren stepped forward. Captain, we can't just... Harper raised a hand. Enough. The single word cut through the noise. Lauren stopped. The captain's voice remained controlled, but something inside it had hardened. Why was this passenger moved? Lauren searched for words. None of them sounded convincing, even in her own head. Weight balance? Harper held the tablet up slightly. There's no record of it. Lauren's shoulders tightened. The trap was closing, and she knew it. From row 24, Jason spoke up again. Captain, viewers are asking the same question. Harper glanced briefly at the phone. The live stream counter had crossed 100,000. His jaw set, because now the situation had escaped the aircraft entirely. Somewhere on the ground, someone in corporate communications was probably already panicking. Harper turned slowly toward Marcus again. Mr. Bennett. Marcus met his eyes. Yes, Captain. I'm going to ask you one more time. Did anyone give you a legitimate reason for this seat change? Marcus shook his head once. No. The answer came out simple, clean, and impossible to twist. A woman in row 3 spoke up suddenly. I saw him board first class. Another passenger nodded. He walked right past that seat. An older man near the window added quietly. They stopped him at the curtain. The testimonies began stacking one on top of another. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Lauren's composure was beginning to crack. This is getting blown out of proportion. Jason almost laughed under his breath. The phrase sounded absurd now. Harper didn't smile. Instead, he looked down at the manifest again, then back toward Lauren. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of command. Who instructed you to move this passenger? Lauren froze. The question hit the center of the problem. Because there was no instruction. There had only been a glance, an assumption, and a decision made in a moment. Lauren felt the eyes of the entire cabin on her. She tried again. It was a judgment call. Harper stared at her. A judgment call? Jason's viewers exploded in the comments. Marcus didn't move. But something colder appeared behind his calm expression. Because now the truth was finally stepping into the open. Lauren's voice grew sharper. We needed to keep the flight on schedule. Harper's patience snapped. That explanation makes no sense. The captain's tone had shifted. Passengers straightened in their seats, because now the authority in the cabin had chosen a side. Harper turned to Marcus. Mr. Bennett. Marcus waited. Please come with me. Lauren blinked. What? Harper didn't even look at her. I want to discuss this privately. Marcus nodded once. Jason leaned forward. Captain, the stream... Harper cut him off gently. I'm aware. Then he turned toward the cockpit. Mr. Bennett. Marcus stepped forward. The aisle parted instinctively as passengers pulled their legs back. Phones followed his movement. Recording. Watching. The quiet rhythm of footsteps echoed through the cabin as he walked toward the front. When he reached the curtain, he paused. For just a second, his eyes drifted to seat 2A. The leather chair waiting. The glass still untouched. Then he continued forward. The cockpit door opened. Marcus stepped inside. Captain Harper followed. The door closed behind them with a heavy click, and suddenly the cabin erupted into whispers. Jason lowered the phone slightly. Ladies and gentlemen, he murmured to the viewers watching across the country, the CEO of Titan Shield just walked into the cockpit of Atlantic Air Flight 217, and I have a feeling the airline has no idea what kind of storm they just stepped into. The cockpit door shut with a dull mechanical click, sealing Marcus Bennett and Captain Daniel Harper inside a space barely larger than a small office. The hum of avionics filled the silence. Green lights blinked steadily across the instrument panel. Outside the windshield, the Atlanta runway stretched beneath the late afternoon sky, traffic vehicles crawling slowly along the edge of the tarmac. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. Harper lowered himself into the captain's seat and set the tablet with the passenger manifest on the center console. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, studying the man standing in the narrow space behind the pilot chairs. Marcus remained standing, one hand resting lightly against the back of the co-pilot's seat. He looked calm, but the calm had weight behind it now, like deep water that hid powerful currents beneath the surface. The CO pilot, Grace Lynn, turned slightly in her seat. She had watched the entire confrontation unfold through the cockpit door window. Her eyes moved from Marcus to the captain and back again, measuring the tension in the air. Harper finally spoke. Mr. Bennett, I'm going to be straightforward. Marcus nodded once. I appreciate that. The captain leaned back slightly. I've flown commercial aircraft for 32 years. I've dealt with drunk passengers, medical emergencies, mechanical failures, storms that could rip wings off airplanes. His eyes narrowed slightly. But this situation down there is something else. Marcus said nothing. Harper continued. You've got half a plane filming this, a journalist live streaming it, and apparently the internet watching. Grace glanced at the captain's phone lying on the console. Notifications had begun stacking across the screen, like falling dominoes. Marcus finally spoke. I didn't create the situation. Harper looked up. I know. The captain tapped the manifest screen again. You were assigned Seat 2A. Yes, no operational change, no. And the seat is still empty. Marcus's voice stayed level. That's correct. Grace Lynn folded her arms loosely. So someone moved you, without documentation. Marcus gave the faintest nod. The CO pilot leaned back slowly. That's not a scheduling decision. No, Marcus said quietly. It isn't. Silence settled again. Harper stared through the windshield for a moment, watching a baggage vehicle roll past beneath the nose of the aircraft. Then he turned back. I need to ask you something honestly. Marcus waited. Why not just let it go? The question hung in the air. Harper continued before Marcus could answer. You're clearly a successful man. You've got business waiting in San Francisco. A lot of people would have taken the new seat and handled it later through corporate channels. Marcus looked down briefly at the polished floor of the cockpit. Then he lifted his eyes. Because that's exactly how this keeps happening. The words came out quietly, but they landed hard. Grace shifted slightly. Marcus continued. If I sit down quietly, the report says the passenger accepted the change. No issue, no complaint. He paused. And next week, someone else gets moved the same way. Harper studied him. And you decided that wasn't acceptable. Marcus met his gaze. I decided the lie stops here. Grace exhaled slowly. Outside the cockpit, the muffled sound of voices in the cabin drifted through the door. Passengers were still talking, the tension vibrating through the aircraft like electricity. Harper reached for his phone and unlocked it. The screen lit up instantly with headlines. A live video window. Hundreds of thousands of viewers. A hashtag climbing the trending list. Seat 2A. Harper frowned. Well, he muttered, that escalated fast. Grace leaned slightly to see the screen. 200,000 viewers already. Marcus didn't react. Harper looked up at him again. I'm guessing that journalist out there knows who you are. Marcus gave a small nod. Yes. Harper let out a long breath. Corporate is going to love this. Grace glanced at Marcus with curiosity. You run Titan Shield, right? Marcus looked at her. Yes. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. My brother works in network security. She gave a small half smile. Your company keeps him employed. Marcus returned a faint nod. Harper rubbed his temples once, then straightened. All right. His voice carried decision now. I need to call operations. Marcus said nothing. Harper tapped a number into the satellite phone mounted beside the control panel. The line clicked twice before connecting. A voice answered. Atlantic Operations. This is Captain Harper on Flight 217. A brief pause. Yes, Captain. We're aware there's a delay. Harper glanced at Marcus. We have a passenger reassignment issue. Operational weight balance. Harper's eyes hardened. That's not what the manifest says. Silence. Then the voice came back, slower. Can you repeat that, Captain? The manifest still shows the passenger in Seat 2A. Another pause. Longer this time. Marcus watched the captain carefully, because now the situation had climbed one level higher, from a cabin dispute to a corporate problem. The operations manager's voice returned. Captain, can you confirm the passenger's name? Harper looked at Marcus. Marcus Bennett. The line went silent. Not static, not disconnection. Just silence. Grace glanced toward the phone. That reaction usually means someone's typing fast. Marcus crossed his arms lightly, waiting. Finally, the voice came back. Different now. Tight. Yes, Captain. We see the situation. Harper's tone sharpened. Then explain it. The operations manager hesitated. We're escalating this to regional management. Marcus watched the exchange without expression. Harper leaned back slightly in the seat. Good. He ended the call. For a moment, the cockpit was quiet again. Grace looked toward Marcus. You realize something, right? Marcus tilted his head slightly. What's that? Grace gave a small, thoughtful shrug. You didn't just stop a plane. She gestured toward the cabin behind them. You started a national story. Marcus looked through the windshield at the runway stretching ahead. The sun was dropping slowly toward the horizon now, painting the sky in long orange streaks. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Calm, focused, unmoving. After a moment, he spoke. That depends. Grace raised an eyebrow. On what? Marcus's voice was steady. On whether the truth still matters to them. Outside the cockpit door, the murmur of voices in the cabin grew louder, because the passengers had just received an update. Jason Miller's live stream had crossed 300,000 viewers. And somewhere inside Atlantic Air headquarters, executives were realizing that one empty seat on Flight 217 was about to cost them far more than a delayed departure. The cabin had changed. What had started as scattered whispers had grown into something sharper, heavier. Passengers leaned across aisles, murmuring to each other. Phones glowed like small lanterns in the dim cabin light. Every few seconds, another person lifted a device and aimed it toward the closed cockpit door. Lauren Whitaker stood near the galley, arms crossed tightly across her uniform. She could feel the shift in the room, the quiet judgment, the way people looked at her now. A man in row 19 lowered his newspaper slowly and studied her with open disbelief. A woman across the aisle whispered to her husband, not quietly enough. They tried to move him out of first class. Lauren pretended not to hear, but the words landed anyway. Jason Miller sat forward in his seat, elbows resting on his knees, phone still streaming. The viewer count had climbed again. 400,000. Messages were flying past faster than he could read them. Someone had already clipped the video of Marcus standing in the aisle and posted it across multiple platforms. News accounts were beginning to appear in the comments. Tech analysts, legal experts, even a few airline employees from other companies chiming in. Jason exhaled slowly. He had covered cybersecurity conferences, corporate mergers, congressional hearings. None of them moved like this. Stories didn't explode this fast unless something deeper was hiding beneath the surface. He glanced toward the curtain separating first class. Seat 2A still sat empty, like a silent witness. Jason turned his phone slightly so the camera could see it again. Just to be clear for everyone watching, he said quietly into the microphone. That seat has been empty the entire time. A passenger beside him leaned over. Are people really watching this live? Jason nodded. Hundreds of thousands. The man's eyes widened. Up front, Lauren shifted her weight again. Her confidence was slipping, because she knew something the passengers didn't yet understand. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. The moment the name Marcus Bennett started spreading online, the story had grown teeth, and now the entire plane was waiting for the cockpit door to open. Row 21. An older woman folded her hands together nervously. "I hope they don't cancel the flight." Her daughter beside her shook her head. "No airline is going to throw that man off the plane now." A businessman across the aisle muttered, "Depends how big he is." Jason turned his head. "He's the CEO of Titan Shield." The man blinked. "The cybersecurity company?" Jason nodded once. $8 billion valuation. The businessman leaned back slowly in his seat. "Well, that explains the confidence." Up front, Lauren felt the pressure building like air inside a sealed chamber. She glanced toward the cockpit again. Still closed. Still silent. Her mind raced through the conversation she imagined happening inside. Operations, management, legal. She tried to steady her breathing, because she knew exactly what question would come next. "Why did you move him?" And there was no answer that sounded good outside her own head. Not anymore. The curtain shifted as a flight attendant from first class stepped halfway into the aisle. Danielle Brooks, 29 years old, quiet, observant. She had watched the entire incident unfold from the front cabin. Now her eyes moved slowly across the rows. The phones, the whispering passengers. Lauren caught her glance. "Everything under control," Lauren said quickly. Danielle didn't reply. Instead, she walked forward a few steps and looked directly at Jason's phone screen. The comment feed rolled past in a blur. Her eyes widened slightly. Then she looked toward the cockpit door again. Jason noticed the exchange. "Do you want to say something for the stream?" he asked gently. Danielle shook her head immediately. "No." Her voice stayed soft. "But I will say this." She glanced toward seat 2A. "That seat has been empty since boarding." The sentence landed with quiet certainty. Jason's viewers exploded again. Lauren's face went pale. "Danielle." But the younger flight attendant had already stepped back toward first class. She said nothing else. She didn't need to. Jason lowered his phone slightly, stunned by how quickly the moment had shifted. One witness, one sentence. And suddenly the narrative had hardened into something much harder to control. A young man across the aisle whispered to his girlfriend, "They're going to fire someone over this," Jason muttered under his breath. Maybe more than someone. Then the cockpit door opened. Every head in the cabin turned at once. Captain Daniel Harper stepped out first. His expression was controlled, but the tension around his eyes told a different story. Marcus Bennett followed him into the aisle. Still calm, still composed. But something had changed. The cabin fell completely silent. Even the whispering stopped. Harper looked across the rows of watching passengers, then toward Lauren. "Ms. Whitaker." Lauren stepped forward quickly. "Yes, Captain." The pause that followed stretched long enough to tighten every muscle in the room. Harper spoke slowly. "Mr. Bennett will be returning to seat 2A. The sentence dropped like a stone. For half a second, nobody reacted. Then the cabin erupted, not cheering, not applause, just a loud rush of voices. Relief, validation, recognition. Lauren's face went rigid. "But Captain—" Harper's voice cut her off. "That seat belongs to him." The authority in the words left no room for argument. Marcus didn't move yet. He simply stood there, watching the reactions ripple through the cabin. Jason lifted his phone again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said quietly to the live audience, "the captain just confirmed Marcus Bennett is returning to his first-class seat." The viewer count jumped again. 500,000. Marcus finally stepped forward. Passengers instinctively pulled their legs in as he passed. Phones followed him, recording every second. When he reached the curtain, he paused. Seat 2A waited on the other side, the leather untouched, the glass still standing. He rested one hand briefly on the headrest, then turned slightly toward the cabin. For a moment his eyes met Jason's. Jason understood instantly. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because outside this airplane, the story had already spread. And somewhere far away, in offices where executives watched screens fill with headlines, people were beginning to realize that one empty seat on Flight 217 had just turned into the most expensive mistake their airline had ever made. Marcus Bennett stepped through the curtain into first class. The atmosphere on the other side felt completely different. Wider seats, softer lighting, a faint scent of leather and warm towels lingering in the air. But the tension had followed him. Passengers in the front cabin were already turned in their seats, watching him with the same quiet intensity as the economy cabin behind the curtain. Several phones lifted instantly. Seat 2A waited beside the window, exactly where it had been the entire time. Untouched. The folded blanket still sat neatly on the armrest. The champagne glass rested on the tray table like it had been placed there minutes ago for a passenger who never arrived. Marcus stopped beside the seat. He studied it for a moment. Not with triumph, with something quieter, something heavier. Then he placed his hand on the back of the chair and slowly sat down. The leather sank softly beneath his weight. For the first time since boarding, he allowed himself to breathe out. Behind the curtain, the economy cabin was still buzzing. Jason Miller kept the camera steady as Marcus took his seat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said quietly to the stream, "Seat 2A has finally been reclaimed." The viewer count rolled upward again. 600,000. Jason lowered the phone slightly, glancing towards the front. Marcus Bennett didn't look like a man celebrating a victory. He looked like someone thinking about the next move. Across the aisle, a grey-haired man in a tailored blazer leaned forward. "You handled that with remarkable restraint," he said. Marcus turned his head slightly. "Thank you." The man nodded once. "I've been in corporate negotiations for 40 years. Most people lose their temper long before things reach this point." Marcus gave a faint smile. "Losing control is rarely useful." The older man chuckled softly. "I can see why your company does well." Behind them, the curtain shifted again as Captain Daniel Harper stepped into the first-class cabin. The conversations immediately faded. Harper walked directly toward Marcus. His voice was low. "Mr. Bennett." Marcus looked up. "Yes, Captain." Harper stood beside the seat for a moment. "I owe you an apology." The words carried through the quiet cabin. On behalf of this aircraft and Atlantic Air, I'm sorry this happened. Marcus studied him carefully. I appreciate you saying that. Harper nodded once. But the situation isn't finished yet. Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly. Corporate? Harper gave a short exhale. They're calling every 5 minutes. Jason's phone vibrated again as the live comments flooded the screen. News networks had started running the clip. Several technology executives had reposted the story. The hashtag Seat2A had moved to the top of the national trending list. Jason leaned forward slightly. Captain, if I may. Harper looked at him. Yes? The story is everywhere now. Harper nodded grimly. I noticed. Jason tilted the phone so Harper could see. The view count had crossed 800,000. Harper stared at the screen for a moment. Then he looked back at Marcus. You understand this is going to cause a serious problem for the airline. Marcus answered quietly. It already has. The captain didn't disagree. Instead, he glanced toward the curtain again. Lauren Whitaker stood just beyond it, rigid and silent. Harper's voice lowered. This is likely going to become a formal investigation. Marcus rested his hands lightly on the armrests. That's not my decision. Harper nodded slowly. But it started because you refused to sit down. Marcus looked out the window. The sun was dropping lower now, casting long orange streaks across the runway. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke. Captain, I've spent my entire career protecting companies from invisible threats. Harper waited. Marcus continued. Most attacks start with something small, a pause, a weakness nobody wants to admit exists. Harper folded his arms. And you think this airline has a weakness? Marcus looked back at him. I think the world just saw it. The words landed harder than anyone expected. Jason glanced at the phone again. 900,000 viewers. The stream comments were exploding. One message repeated again and again. Who moved him? Another. Why was he moved? And a third. What happens next? Harper noticed the same question forming across the cabin. Because the situation had passed the point of a simple apology. Marcus Bennett had returned to Seat 2A. But the story wasn't finished. Harper straightened. Mr. Bennett. Marcus looked up. I've been instructed to inform you that Atlantic Air's regional management team is already reviewing the situation. Marcus nodded. Good. They will likely contact you after landing. Marcus's voice remained steady. I'll be available. Harper hesitated for a moment. Then he said something quieter. Between you and me, they're nervous. Marcus leaned back slightly in the seat. They should be. Across the aisle, the older businessman shook his head slowly. I have a feeling the boardroom conversations tonight are going to be unpleasant. Jason let out a soft breath. Understatement of the year. The captain glanced toward the cockpit. We need to get this aircraft moving. He turned toward the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will begin pushback shortly. A few passengers clapped lightly. Not loudly. Just enough to acknowledge the moment. Marcus looked down briefly at the glass of champagne waiting beside him. He lifted it slowly. The liquid shimmered in the evening light. He took a single, quiet sip. Then he placed the glass back on the tray table. Jason whispered into the stream. This might look like the end of the story. He paused. But it's not. Because at that exact moment, thousands of miles away, in a corporate office tower, executives inside Atlantic Air headquarters were watching the same video. And they were beginning to realize something terrifying. Marcus Bennett wasn't just a passenger who had been moved from first class. He was a man whose company protected half the digital infrastructure in the country. And the mistake made on Flight 217 was about to cost them far more than one empty seat. 30,000 feet above Georgia, the aircraft had not yet moved. But somewhere far away, inside a glass tower overlooking Manhattan, Atlantic Air's executive floor had already erupted into controlled chaos. The conference room screens glowed with the same image playing over and over again. Marcus Bennett standing in the aisle, Lauren Whitaker blocking his path, passengers filming, the empty first-class seat visible behind the curtain. The video paused on the moment when the captain confirmed the assignment. Seat 2A belongs to him. Around the table sat 8 senior executives, none of them speaking. At the far end, the chief operating officer leaned forward slowly. How bad is it? A young analyst beside the screen swallowed. The live stream crossed 1 million viewers 10 minutes ago. Silence. Another executive cleared his throat. And the media? The analyst tapped the keyboard. 3 major networks already picked it up. The screen switched. A news headline appeared. Black Tech CEO removed from first-class seat. Another screen lit up. Airline under fire after video goes viral. The COO closed his eyes briefly. Who approved the seat change? No one answered, because the answer had already become painfully obvious. Nobody had. Back on the aircraft, the engines finally began to whine softly as ground crews prepared for pushback. Passengers adjusted in their seats. The tension had not disappeared, but it had shifted. Now it carried the feeling of aftermath, of something already decided. Marcus Bennett sat quietly beside the window, watching the fading sunlight streak across the runway. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. Across the aisle, the grey-haired businessman spoke again. I imagine your phone is exploding. Marcus gave a faint nod. It usually does when the internet gets involved. The man chuckled. I suspect your board is watching. Marcus leaned back slightly. They are. Jason Miller, still filming from economy, checked the stream again. The number at the top of the screen rolled past 1.2 million viewers. His voice stayed low. For everyone just joining, Marcus Bennett is now seated in the first-class seat he was originally assigned. He paused. But the bigger story isn't the seat anymore. Jason turned the camera slightly so the audience could see the first-class cabin. The quiet tension. The captain speaking briefly with the crew. The passenger who had just become the center of a national conversation. This, Jason said softly, is about what happens next. Behind the curtain, Lauren Whitaker stood near the galley, staring down at the floor. She had stopped trying to control the situation. Now she simply waited. Because the next move wasn't hers anymore. A younger flight attendant beside her whispered carefully, Lauren. She didn't respond. The girl tried again. Corporate just called the purser. Lauren's shoulders stiffened slightly. What did they say? The younger attendant hesitated. They're asking for a full report. Lauren closed her eyes briefly. Of course they were. And reports meant timelines, statements, decisions. Everything she had said in the aisle would now be examined frame by frame. Meanwhile, the plane began to roll backward slowly as the tug pushed it away from the gate. The cabin shifted with the movement. Passengers looked out of the windows as the terminal began sliding past. Captain Harper's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your patience. We are now pushing back from the gate and will begin taxi shortly. The announcement sounded calm, professional, but the entire aircraft understood that nothing about the last hour had been normal. Marcus finally pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen lit up instantly with notifications. Dozens of messages. Hundreds. Thousands. His assistant. His legal team. His board. A message from Rachel Lawson, his COO, sat at the top. Call me. Marcus read it, then locked the phone again without dialing. Across the aisle, the businessman watched him carefully. You're not calling anyone? Marcus shook his head once. Not yet. The man smiled faintly. Interesting strategy. Marcus looked back toward the window. It's not strategy. The man raised an eyebrow. Then what is it? Marcus's voice stayed quiet. Patience. Jason's phone buzzed again. A notification popped onto the screen from a major financial network. Atlantic Air stock drops 3% after viral video. Jason whistled softly. Well, that didn't take long. The passenger beside him leaned closer. 3%? Jason nodded. And markets haven't even closed yet. Back in first class, Marcus sat motionless. But inside his mind, the calculation had already begun. He understood systems, weaknesses, pressure points. One empty seat had exposed something deeper, not just about one airline, about how quickly assumptions could travel through an entire organization, from a glance, to a decision, to a mistake now seen by millions. Captain Harper stepped into the first-class cabin again, checking on the crew. His eyes met Marcus briefly. There was something different in the captain's expression now. Not just apology. Respect. Because he understood something too. Marcus Bennett had never raised his voice. Never threatened anyone. Never demanded special treatment. He had simply refused to accept a lie. The aircraft turned slowly onto the taxiway. The engines deepened. Passengers settled back into their seats. But Jason Miller leaned toward the phone one more time. For those watching, he said quietly, this flight hasn't even taken off yet. He glanced toward seat 2A. Marcus Bennett sat by the window, calm as ever, the fading sunlight reflecting across the glass beside him. Jason lowered his voice. And if you think the story ends here, you haven't been paying attention. Because somewhere inside Atlantic Air headquarters, executives were now discovering something far more dangerous than a viral video. Marcus Bennett's company didn't just protect corporations from cyber attacks. It also controlled the security systems used by several major airlines, including Atlantic Air. The aircraft rolled slowly along the taxiway, engines humming deeper as dusk settled across the Atlanta runway. Inside the cabin, the tension had not faded. It had simply shifted into something quieter and more dangerous. People were no longer whispering about the seat. They were whispering about Marcus Bennett. In first class, the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft aligned for departure. The quiet elegance of the space had returned, but the atmosphere was still charged. Marcus sat with one arm resting lightly on the armrest, watching the fading orange horizon outside the window. The runway lights blinked on one by one, stretching into the distance like a glowing path. His phone vibrated again in his hand. This time he glanced at it. Rachel Lawson, he answered. Marcus. Her voice was tight. I'm watching the stream. I assumed you would be. Silence for a second. Then Rachel exhaled sharply. You realize the entire tech industry is watching this too. Marcus looked out at the wing as the flaps began adjusting for takeoff. Yes. Do you want me to call their legal department? Marcus thought for a moment. No. Rachel paused. No? Not yet. Another pause. Marcus, Atlantic Air's CEO, called our office 10 minutes ago. That caught his attention. What did he say? He asked if you were still on the plane. Marcus allowed himself the faintest smile. I am. Rachel's voice softened slightly. You know what this means, right? Marcus looked down the runway. Yes. You just forced a conversation that airline executives avoid at all costs. Marcus ended the call quietly. Across the aisle, the grey-haired businessman had been watching the entire exchange. Boardroom politics? Marcus nodded once. Something like that. Behind the curtain, Jason Miller was still narrating quietly to the stream. The view count had crossed 2 million. He leaned closer to the camera. For those joining late, we are currently taxiing for takeoff. Marcus Bennett is seated in first class after being forced out of that seat earlier. He turned the camera toward the curtain again. The bigger question now isn't the seat. Jason lowered his voice. It's what happens when this plane lands. A comment flashed across the stream. He read it out loud. Someone just posted that Atlantic Air uses Titan Shield software for their passenger security systems. Jason blinked. Wait. He refreshed the comment feed. More confirmations appeared. Another aviation analyst posted documentation. Another industry insider confirmed the contract. Jason slowly leaned back in his seat. Well, that's interesting. A passenger beside him looked over. What? Jason whispered. The man sitting in seat 2A, his company secures airline passenger databases. The passenger stared at him. You're kidding. Jason shook his head. No. Up front, the engines roared louder as the aircraft stopped at the runway threshold. Captain Harper's voice returned over the intercom. Cabin crew, prepare for departure. The final quiet settled over the plane. Marcus rested his head back against the seat and closed his eyes briefly. Not to sleep, to think, because Rachel's words had been correct. This was bigger than a seat. Much bigger. For years, Titan Shield had quietly provided cybersecurity infrastructure for airlines, banks, government agencies, and medical networks. Invisible systems protecting invisible vulnerabilities. Most passengers never thought about it. Most executives didn't either. Until something broke. The engine surged. The aircraft began accelerating down the runway. Passengers pressed gently into their seats as the speed increased. Jason gripped the armrest with one hand while still filming with the other. "Here we go," he whispered. The runway lights blurred into streaks. The aircraft lifted. Atlanta fell away beneath them. Inside first class, Marcus opened his eyes again as the plane climbed through the evening sky. He watched the clouds swallow the last view of the runway. Across the aisle, the businessman chuckled quietly. "You just became the most famous passenger in America." Marcus shook his head. "No." The man raised an eyebrow. "No?" Marcus looked straight ahead. "I became a problem." Back in New York, the Atlantic Air Executive Conference Room had grown tense. Phones buzzed constantly. Emails stacked faster than anyone could read them. The chief operating officer paced slowly across the floor. "Tell me again." The analyst at the screen swallowed. "Titan Shield manages the encryption layer for our passenger verification network." The COO stopped walking, and the CEO of that company is currently trending on every news platform in the country because we removed him from first class. The analyst nodded. The room went silent again, because now the story had crossed a line, from embarrassment to vulnerability. Back in the aircraft, Marcus Bennett sat quietly in seat 2 while the plane climbed above the clouds. Jason Miller's live stream crossed 2.5 million viewers, and thousands of miles away, lawyers, executives, and journalists were all beginning to ask the same question. What happens when the man protecting your digital infrastructure becomes the victim of your biggest public mistake? The aircraft leveled above the clouds as the last traces of sunset faded into a deep indigo sky. Inside the cabin, the tension that had gripped the plane for the past hour began settling into something quieter, heavier. Passengers reclined their seats. The hum of the engines smoothed into a steady rhythm. Flight attendants moved slowly through the aisles again, their smiles careful, their voices softer than before. Seat 2. It remained the center of attention, even though nobody was staring directly at it anymore. Marcus Bennett sat beside the window, his reflection faintly visible in the dark glass. City lights flickered far below like scattered embers across the country. His posture had not changed much since takeoff. Calm, straight, measured. The same posture that he carried into boardrooms, negotiations, and crisis meetings. But inside the aircraft, the story was still unfolding. Jason Miller sat 3 rows behind the curtain, phone balanced carefully in his hand as the live stream continued. The viewer count hovered near 3 million now. The comment feed had slowed slightly, replaced by longer reactions from people watching across the country. News networks had begun broadcasting segments. Financial analysts were already discussing the impact. Jason leaned slightly toward the camera. "For those still watching," he said quietly, "Atlantic Air Flight 217 is now cruising toward San Francisco. Marcus Bennett is seated in first class where he was originally assigned, but the bigger story has moved far beyond this cabin." He glanced at his phone again. Another alert flashed across the screen. Atlantic Air issues statement following viral incident. Jason tapped the article open. He read silently for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. Well, that didn't take long. Across the aisle, the passenger beside him leaned closer. "What does it say?" Jason lowered his voice. "Corporate apology, internal investigation, commitment to review employee procedures." The passenger chuckled softly. "That's executive language for someone's losing their job." Jason didn't respond, because he knew the consequences would probably be much bigger than that. Up in first class, the service cart rolled quietly down the aisle. Danielle Brooks paused beside seat 2A. "Mr. Bennett," she said gently. Marcus looked up. "Yes." "I wanted to apologize personally." Her voice carried a sincerity that was impossible to fake. "For what happened earlier." Marcus studied her expression. "You weren't the one who made the decision." Danielle nodded slowly. "No." She hesitated. "But I watched it happen." Marcus gave a small, understanding nod. "That matters too." She placed a glass of water on the tray table. "If there's anything you need during the flight, please let me know." "Thank you." Danielle moved on quietly. Across the aisle, the older businessman watched the exchange. "You've handled this remarkably well." Marcus glanced toward him. "I've had practice." The man chuckled. "Most executives I know would have threatened lawsuits before the plane even left the gate." Marcus rested his hands lightly together. "That would have solved nothing." The man tilted his head slightly. "So what does solve it?" Marcus looked out the window again. Visibility. The word hung there. Because that was exactly what had happened. An invisible assumption had been dragged into the light. Behind the curtain, Jason's phone buzzed again. A new message appeared from Rachel Lawson. Jason read it and raised his eyebrows. "What?" the passenger beside him asked. Jason shook his head slowly. "Titan Shield just posted a statement." He opened the link and began reading quietly. The statement was short, clear. "Titan Shield reaffirms its commitment to fairness, transparency, and accountability across every industry it supports." Jason exhaled softly. "That's corporate language for something big is coming." In first class, Marcus's phone vibrated again. He checked the screen. A message from Rachel. "The board is standing with you." Another message followed seconds later. The entire company watched the live stream. Marcus placed the phone back down. For a long moment, he simply looked at the dark sky beyond the glass. Because he understood something that the passengers on this plane were only beginning to realize. This moment would travel far beyond one flight. It would appear in boardrooms, training programs, corporate policy meetings. Everywhere people were forced to confront how quickly assumptions could turn into decisions, and how powerful it was when someone refused to accept them. Across the aisle, the businessman leaned back in his seat. "You changed something today." Marcus didn't answer immediately. After a moment, he said quietly, "I reminded people to look twice." Behind the curtain, Jason Miller slowly ended the live stream. 3 million viewers faded to 0 as the camera went dark. He leaned back in his seat and exhaled. The plane continued west through the night sky. Somewhere far below, the country stretched across thousands of miles of highways, cities, homes, and airports. Millions of people had just watched a man stand in an airplane aisle and refuse to sit down. Not with anger, not with threats, just with quiet certainty. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes the smallest moment became the spark that forced an entire system to see itself more clearly. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to press like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story where ordinary moments reveal extraordinary truth. And before you go, leave a comment with 3 simple words. Stand for dignity.